If you walk into a local bank and ask to see the vault, they might show you a heavy steel door and stacks of paper bills bound in plastic. It feels real. It feels heavy. It smells like old linen and ink. But if you could zoom out and look at the entire United States economy, you'd realize that all that green paper, the stuff you can actually touch, is basically just pocket change. It's a rounding error. The real money, the trillions of dollars that move the earth, fund wars, and build cities, doesn't exist in a vault. It doesn't even exist as paper. It was never printed. It was never minted. In fact, if you go looking for the printing press that created the last $5 trillion added to the economy, you won't find a machine at all. You'll find a keyboard. The most uncomfortable truth in modern economics is that the United States government can spend money it doesn't have, and it doesn't need a printing press to do it. The process is quieter, more clinical, and far more consequential than just running a machine. It's a digital sleight of hand performed by two of the most powerful institutions on the planet, the U.S. Treasury and the Federal Reserve. They have mastered a system that allows them to manifest wealth out of thin air, and they do it so efficiently that most people don't even realize the money in their bank account is essentially a digital ghost. Right now, we are living through the largest monetary experiment in human history. To understand how we got here and why your groceries cost 30% more than they did 3 years ago, you have to stop thinking about money as an object. You have to start thinking about it as a legal agreement. Specifically, an agreement to move numbers from one digital ledger to another. Let's look at this setup. Imagine the US government wants to spend $100 billion. Maybe it's for a new fleet of fighter jets, or a bridge in Ohio, or a stimulus check. The problem is, the government's checking account at the Treasury is running low. They've already spent all the tax revenue they collected from you and me. In the old world, the king would just shave the edges off gold coins or mix copper into the silver. In the 20th century, they might have actually revved up the physical presses. But today, the Treasury does something much more elegant. They issue a piece of paper or a digital entry called a Treasury bond. A bond is nothing more than a formal IOU. It's a promise. The government says, give us $1,000 today, and we promise to give it back to you in 10 years, plus a little bit of interest. It is considered the safest investment in the world because it's backed by the full faith and credit of the United States. That's a fancy way of saying it's backed by the government's power to tax 330 million people and the most powerful military in history. So, the Treasury holds an auction. They tell the world they have IOUs for sale. Big banks, foreign governments, and pension funds all show up to buy them. They swap their existing dollars for these government promises. At this stage, no new money has been created. The money just moved from a bank's vault to the government's vault. It's a zero-sum game, or at least it's supposed to be. But here is where the magic and the danger begins. Because sometimes the government wants to spend so much money that there aren't enough private buyers for all those IOUs. Or, perhaps more accurately, if the government tried to sell that many IOUs to the public, they'd have to offer a massive interest rate to convince people to buy them. High interest rates are bad for politicians. They slow down the economy. They make mortgages expensive. They make the government's own debt more expensive to carry. Enter the Federal Reserve. The Fed is the central bank of the United States. It's a strange hybrid creature, half government, half private, and it sits at the center of the financial universe. The Fed has a unique superpower that no other entity on Earth possesses. It has a digital checkbook that is not linked to any bank account. When the Fed wants to buy something, it doesn't need to have money in its account. It simply writes a check, or more accurately, it types a number into a computer. This is the hidden mechanism. When the Treasury needs more money than the market is willing to lend at a low price, the Federal Reserve steps in. The Fed doesn't buy the bonds directly from the Treasury. That would be too obvious. Instead, they buy them from the big banks on Wall Street, known as primary dealers. The transaction looks like this. The Fed calls up a major bank and says, "We want to buy $1 billion worth of Treasury bonds from you." The bank says, "Great." The Fed takes the bonds and puts them on its own balance sheet. Then the Fed goes to its computer and increases the balance of that bank's reserve account by $1 billion. Poof. That $1 billion didn't exist 5 seconds ago. It wasn't moved from another account. It wasn't taxed. It wasn't earned. It was simply typed into existence. The bank now has $1 billion in new digital cash, which it can then use to buy more bonds from the Treasury or lend out to businesses and homebuyers. This is the printing press of the 21st century. It's not ink and paper, it's a ledger entry. Now you might ask, if they can just type money into existence, why do I have to work 40 hours a week for it? Why do we pay taxes at all? This is where the irony of the system becomes apparent. The system works only as long as people believe it works. Money is a collective hallucination. As long as you believe that $20 bill or that digital number in your banking app can be traded for a steak or a gallon of gas, the system remains stable. But there is a catch. You cannot create trillions of new digital dollars without affecting the value of the dollars already in circulation. Think of it like a pizza. If you have one pizza cut into 8 slices, each slice is a certain size. If you decide to cut that same pizza into 16 slices, you have more slices, but each one is half as big. The Fed isn't making more pizza, they're just cutting the slices thinner. When the Fed creates new digital dollars to buy government debt, they are increasing the total supply of money. When there is more money chasing the same amount of goods and services, houses, cars, eggs, Netflix subscriptions, the price of those things goes up. This is the hidden tax. The government doesn't have to send you a bill to take your wealth, they just make the dollars in your pocket worth less. It is a remarkably efficient way to fund a country. It avoids the political suicide of raising taxes. Most people don't understand why prices are rising. They blame the grocery store, the oil companies, or the supply chain. They rarely look at the man behind the curtain typing numbers into a terminal in a gray building in Washington, D.C. The scale of this is hard to wrap your head around. For most of the 20th century, the Federal Reserve's balance sheet, the total amount of stuff it had bought with created money, was relatively small. It was measured in the hundreds of billions. But after the 2008 financial crisis, the doors were thrown wide open. They called it quantitative easing. It sounds like a medical procedure or a technical adjustment. In reality, it was an unprecedented flood of digital money creation. Then came 2020. In a matter of months, the Fed created more money than it had in the previous century combined. They weren't just buying government bonds, they were buying corporate debt, mortgage-backed securities, and effectively propping up the entire global financial system with a flood of digital liquidity. This brings us to the absurdity of the debt ceiling debates we see on the news every few years. Politicians argue and shout about whether the US can afford to pay its bills. They act as if the government is like a household that has to balance its checkbook. But a household can't print its own money. A household doesn't own a central bank that can manifest currency at will. The limit is entirely self-imposed. The only real limit to how much the government can print isn't a legal ceiling, it's the point at which the public loses faith in the dollar and inflation turns into a bonfire. The system is built on a mountain of IOUs that will never ever be paid back. Think about that for a second. The US national debt is over $34 trillion. There is no plan to pay it off. There is no savings account waiting to clear the balance. The plan is simply to issue new debt to pay off the old debt and have the Federal Reserve stand by with its digital keyboard to make sure the wheels keep turning. It feels like a scam. It sounds like a Ponzi scheme. If you or I did this, writing checks from an empty account and then telling our neighbors that those checks are actually assets, we'd be in a federal prison before the ink dried. But when the government does it, it's called monetary policy. The genius of this system is how it hides the cost. If the government raised your taxes by 10%, you'd be furious. You'd vote them out. But if the government creates new money and your cost of living goes up by 10%, you're just stressed. You feel like you're falling behind. You think you need a raise. You don't realize that the value of your labor has been harvested to pay for the government's spending without your explicit consent. So, what is the reality versus the hype? The hype is that the US is broke. You hear this all the time on talk radio and social media. The US is going bankrupt. But a country that prints the world's reserve currency can never truly go bankrupt in the traditional sense. They can always create more digital dollars to pay the nominal bill. The reality isn't bankruptcy, it's debasement. The US won't run out of money, the money will just run out of value. We are currently in a high-stakes game of chicken. The Treasury keeps issuing debt to fund a lifestyle the country can't afford. The Fed keeps managing the digital supply to prevent a total collapse. And the rest of us are left trying to figure out how to save for a future in a currency that is intentionally designed to lose value over time. There's a quiet humor in the way we treat this. We check our bank balances on our phones. We see a number, maybe $5,000. We feel a sense of security. But that $5,000 is just a digital promise from a bank, which is backed by a digital promise from the Fed, which is backed by a digital promise from the Treasury. It's promises all the way down. There is no gold, there is no silver, there is only full faith. And full faith is a fragile thing. It's the ultimate vibe-based economy. As long as the rest of the world, China, Japan, Europe, and the oil-producing nations continues to accept these digital US dollars as the ultimate form of payment, the game continues. We export nothing, and we import everything, electronics, clothes. It is the greatest trade in the history of civilization. But what happens when the keyboard clicks too many times? What happens when the numbers on the screen get so high that they lose their meaning? We are told this system is necessary. We are told that without this elastic money supply, the economy would seize up, depressions would be frequent, and progress would stall. And maybe that's true. Maybe the alternative is worse. But it's worth asking, who does this system actually serve? It serves the government, which can spend without limit. It serves the big banks, which sit at the mouth of the money fountain and take their cut before the new dollars reach the rest of us. It serves the debtors, who get to pay back their loans with cheaper dollars in the future. But it doesn't serve the saver. It doesn't serve the person who works a fixed-wage job and tries to put a little bit away every month. In this system, saving is just a slow-motion way of losing. As we move further into the digital age, the printing press will become even more of a relic. We are already talking about central bank digital currencies, CBDC, a system where the Fed doesn't even need the middleman of a private bank. They could just deposit digital tokens directly into your phone. At that point, the separation between money and government decree disappears entirely. The $15 trillion that exists in the US M2 money supply, the total of all cash, checking accounts, and savings, is largely a phantom. Only about 10% of that exists as physical cash. The rest is just light on a screen. We often talk about the national debt as a burden we are leaving for our children. But that's a misunderstanding. The debt isn't a bill that will be paid in the future. The debt is the mechanism by which the money was created in the first place. If we paid off the national debt tomorrow, the money supply would literally vanish. The debt is the money. This leads us to a final uncomfortable thought. If our entire financial system is built on a foundation of digital entries created by a keyboard, and those entries are backed by nothing but our collective agreement to keep playing the game, what happens if we stop agreeing? We like to think of our economy as a solid, grounded machine, an engine of industry and innovation. And in many ways, it is. But the fuel that runs that engine is a digital fiction. We have replaced the printing press with something much faster and much more dangerous: the ability to edit reality with a keystroke. As you go about your day, look at the prices around you. Look at the balance in your account. And remember that the money you're using wasn't found in a mine or earned through some physical law of the universe. It was willed into existence by a small group of people in a room who decided that today the world needed a few more zeros. The question isn't whether the system will break. The system is designed to break a little bit every single day through inflation. The question is how much longer we can pretend that a number on a screen is the same thing as wealth. We are all participants in a grand experiment, living in the shadow of a digital press that never stops. We are told that this is the only way a modern world can function. But as the numbers grow larger and the dollars buy less, you have to wonder, at what point does the fiction become too heavy for the reality to support? The next time you hear about the government finding money for a new program or rescuing the economy, don't look for the trucks carrying bags of cash. They aren't coming. Instead, listen for the sound of a finger hitting the enter key. That is where your money comes from. And that is where its value goes to die. The system survives on your trust, but it pays you in digital promises. It's the most successful magic trick in history. But the thing about magic tricks is that once you know how they work, they never quite look the same again. So, here is the unresolved question we are left with. If the US Treasury and the Fed can solve any problem by simply adding zeros to a ledger, why do we still have problems? Or perhaps the more terrifying question, is the printing of that digital money the solution to our problems, or is it the source of them? We are living in an era of infinite digital money, but we still live in a world of finite resources. Eventually, those two realities have to meet. And when they do, no amount of typing will be able to change the math.